All right, welcome to the fourth video on Unit 1, the Constitution. What you're seeing here, we've gotten to know pretty well at this point. This is your main idea number 4 worksheet. This goes along with the Principles of the Constitution video that we are doing right now. Remember, we are answering these in complete sentences. There are 5 questions here. Do them with the video, do them after the video, use your notes, whatever you need to do. Make sure you grab them and get them done. All right, let's get to it for the day. We have gone over the executive, the legislative, the judicial branches. We have gone over the history and context of the Constitution. We have gone over the checks and balances and leading up to the ratification of the Constitution. Now we need to talk about the problems that we ran into and some compromises that we needed to make along the way. First of all, we know that there are all 13 states that used to be colonies now coming together, forming this country. They're not the same. They're not the same size. They're not the same geographically. They're not the same socially. Economically, they're very different. So, of course, we were going to run into some problems. The very first problem that we run into comes down to small states versus large states. The struggle here that we see is with representation. How are we going to represent equally small states versus large states? Should larger states have more power just because they're bigger? Should smaller states be left behind? So representation is the question here. The first plan that we look at is the Virginia plan. Virginia is a large state, so this is also called the Large State Plan. This plan proposed the idea that we would have 2 houses in Congress, both of them being based on population. All right, cool. But what happens if you're a small state? Do you just get left behind? Are you not important? That's when the New Jersey plan comes into play. The New Jersey plan, New Jersey is a small state, this is also called the small state plan, is to have 1 house in Congress where every state is represented equally. Now, neither of those plans sound like they're helping everybody out. It doesn't sound fair. So the first compromise we make is known as the Great Compromise, and this gives us what we call the bicameral legislature. Bi stands for 2, cameral being in Congress, 2 houses in Congress is what we end up with. So the compromise is that this new government would have 2 houses. 1 house that would be based on population, like the Virginia plan wanted, and 1 house that would be represented equally no matter what the size or population count was of any state, and that's what we get from the New Jersey plan. So in the end, with the Great Compromise, we get the House of Representatives based on population, and we get the Senate based equally among all, at the time, 13 states. The second problem we come up with when we're designing the Constitution is the issue of slavery. Now, the debate was that in the North, slaves were said to have not counted as people. Never in any discussion has Southerners said that slaves are people, that they are contributing members to their population. So why now, when it comes down to representation, should they get to count when it's in favor of the South? Now, of course, the South is going to say, well, slaves should count because that's going to give them more representation. More representation is more power. So you have the Northern opinion that slaves should not count, and you have the Southern opinion that slaves should count. So the solution here is kind of meeting each in the middle, and it's known as the 3/5 compromise. Again, U.S. history, we're not coming up with crazy names here. The reason it is called the 3/5 compromise is because the compromise states that 3 out of every 5 slaves would count towards the census. Remember, census is the count of the population. So out of every 5 slaves, 3 of them would count towards the census and gain more representation in Congress for the South. The Three-Fifths Compromise is where you see slavery written into the Constitution. So on this issue of slavery, the solution here was the Three-Fifths Compromise. Those are the 2 main compromises within the Constitution. Not that there weren't many more, but those are the 2 that we focus on. Now, within the Constitution, you can find that there are principles or main ideas that are stressed. First and foremost comes in the preamble. Preamble is just a fancy word for introduction. Now, you have seen this a million times over, the big "We the People." We the People, the statement at the beginning of this document, is referring to the idea that the Constitution is based on. A government for the people, by the people, which you've heard a million times. This principle, the very beginning of the Constitution, is known as popular sovereignty. Popular meaning the population, the populace of people, sovereignty together. Together we do this. All of us together. And the reason being that the Constitution starts with this is the most important principle of the Constitution. The idea that the government gets its power from the people is the reason that we're coming up with this new form of government. We didn't like England because we had no voice in the government. The people had no say. So, of course, we create a government where the main voice is of the people. Popular sovereignty, the power of the government coming directly from the people. Now, so that you can hear a little bit of a different take on it, let's go back to Schoolhouse Rock so that you can hear about the preamble.
Hey, do you know about the USA? Do you know about the government? Can you tell me about the Constitution? Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free. The USA was just starting out, a whole brand new country. And so our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers all sat down and wrote a list of principles that's known the world around. The USA was just starting out, a whole brand new country. And so our people spelled it out. They wanted a land of liberty. And the preamble goes like this. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, for the United States of America.
All right, so the preamble, the beginning of the Constitution, the introduction, where the ideas for the rest of the document are being laid out, and where we get the first glimpse of these principles of the Constitution with we the people referring to popular sovereignty. We all together give the government its power. Now, another principle within the Constitution is federalism, and this is a big one. To define federalism is to say that we have a dual system of government, the power being divided between the national government and the state governments. So, what this means is that we do have two governments that are functioning at the same time. We have the federal government, where that's what we've been talking about throughout this whole unit. We've got Congress, we've got the president, we have the Supreme Court, and then we have the state government, where you also see a state legislature. You have your governor, you have state courts. So there are these two governments that are functioning at the same time, breaking up that power so that neither one has too much. Now, the difference is here. You have one federal government and you have 50 state governments. Each state has their own government. Don't confuse this with separation of power. Separation of power divides the power between the three branches of government. That's completely different. Federalism is breaking the government into two separate governments, the federal government and the state government. Okay? Now, when we look at this, the Constitution addresses the idea of, well, who has the final say at the end of the day? And that is with the supremacy clause. Supremacy, supreme, who has that higher power, the final say at the end of the day? And that is going to be the federal government. The Constitution declares that federal laws and treaties are supreme over the state laws. Okay? When we look at state versus federal legislatures, federal laws are going to be laws that apply to all 50 states. Everybody has to follow those laws. State laws are only specific to that state. So New York State laws are specific to New York State. When we look at federal bodies, we have the U.S. Senate, we have the United States House of Representatives. Those are the federal bodies of the legislature. State bodies, we have New York State Senate and the Assembly, New York State Assembly. So that's our version of the House of Representatives at the state level. When we look at what these legislatures do, the federal legislature is going to look at national defense, federal taxing, immigration laws. But the state scope is going to look at funding for schools, your state parks, the state environment, and state taxing. Okay, so they're a little bit different in what they do, and there's two different levels of that. Now, this is where it gets a little complicated. When we look at the powers of federalism, there are 5 types of powers. First, delegated. Delegated powers are those that are specifically given to the national government. Powers that fall into the delegated category, printing money. The federal government does that because it would be a mess if the 50 states all printed their own money. It would just be an absolute mess if you had to exchange your money every state you went to. So that's a federal power that's given to the federal government. Also, regulating interstate and foreign trade. So trade that's coming from other countries is regulated by the federal government. Declaring war is a federal power. Could you imagine if we allowed the states to do that? Florida could be at war with Africa, and we wouldn't even know it up here in New York because we could be at war with England. So that is reserved for just the federal government. Military, the declaration of war is we as a whole country do that together. Reserved powers, like you reserve a table at a restaurant, these are powers that are set aside specifically for the states. And these powers include education, intrastate commerce, which is trade between states. So when New York trades with Pennsylvania, they deal with that between each other. Laws within the states are reserved powers, like your traffic laws, marriage and divorce laws, health and safety, like the coming and when the state comes in to evaluate a restaurant. Professional licensing. When you become a teacher, you get licensed in New York State. If you go to another state, you have to apply for their license. It's the same for doctors, it's the same for nurses. A professional license is a reserved power to the state. Now, the third type of powers is concurrent. These are powers that are happening at the same time, simultaneously, that are given to both the national and state governments, and they both can do this. Things that fall into this category: taxing and spending. The federal government collects taxes, the state government collects taxes. Borrowing money. States borrow money, the federal government borrows money. Roads and bridges. Within a state, you have state roads, but you also have federal roads. Okay, you can tell which one you're on in New York State because some are kept up better than others. The court system, the prison system, there are federal prisons and there are state prisons. There are state courts and there are federal courts. These happen at the same time. They belong to both the national and state government. Implied powers. This is also known as the elastic clause, which I know you've been wondering, why the heck are there rubber bands on this slide? Well, the implied powers are referred to as the elastic clause, and it comes from the Constitution, where it states that Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into the execution of the foregoing powers. So necessary and proper is what we focus on right there. This gives the national government the ability to expand or stretch like a rubber band its powers. The Constitution, it covers a wide variety here when it says necessary and proper. Anything could fall into that category to make a law that is for the people. It makes it possible for the national government to carry out its delegated powers and to change over time. They couldn't list within the Constitution the types of laws that could be made by the federal government because the Founding Fathers didn't have an extensive list that would include what we need right now. So implied powers is where you see a little bit of wiggle room in the Constitution to allow for that change over time. And then the last one, the easiest one to remember, is denied powers. This is a specific list of powers that the Constitution does not allow or it forbids. And the best example is the suspending of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is your due process rights. Your right to a speedy trial, your right to a fair trial, your right to a trial by jury. These due process rights of going in and going through the process of the judicial system is something that cannot be taken away by the federal government, or should not be. The Constitution says you cannot do that. Denied powers. Now, the Constitution can be interpreted in a couple different ways, and we're going to see this come up over and over again. But the first way to interpret the Constitution is strictly. A strict interpretation of the Constitution is somebody who reads the Constitution word for word and says, okay, this is what the Constitution says. There is no wiggle room. It is very strictly stated what we can and cannot do, and that's it. If it's not written on the page, that's it. The example of this, a person who supports a strict constructionist view of the Constitution, is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson supported the states' rights power over the federal government because it says the federal government, here are your powers. Let the rest go to the state government. Let the rest go to the people. Okay? The opposite end of this argument is a loose constructionist. The name that comes to mind for loose constructionist, the example, is Alexander Hamilton. He favored federal power over states' rights and said you could interpret the Constitution in many different ways. You could read between the lines and find more powers for the federal government and kind of imply that, maybe it doesn't say we can do this, but it doesn't say we can't. And maybe you said that to your parents before. You didn't say I couldn't do it, so I can. That's a loose constructionist here. If the Constitution doesn't forbid it, then it's permitted. Then we are allowed to do it. So you have strict constructionists versus loose constructionists. And we are going to see Hamilton and Jefferson kind of bat heads over the idea of the national bank. Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, he wants to create a national bank within the United States that deals with our finances, that is something that can be relied on for handling the finances of the United States. Now, in the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about a national bank, but it doesn't say that we can't have one. And Jefferson is going to argue that creating a national bank is an overreach of government powers, and these two gentlemen will argue over that point, and we're going to come back to this in another unit. Now, you heard me earlier in videos before this mention the unwritten Constitution. Now, like I've said a couple of times now, we are not really creative when it comes to naming things in U.S. history. So the unwritten Constitution is things that we follow that are not written in the Constitution. They are tradition and customs that were created during George Washington's presidency that we have followed over time because they work. Not because they were written into the Constitution, but because the first president of the United States did it and it worked for them. Okay, we call this a precedent. George Washington set many precedents or examples in his presidency that made him successful, which then caused presidents after him to follow those examples, to follow those precedents. This is not implied powers by any means. This is tradition. This is just something that was done that worked. This is not going in and finding more powers in the Constitution. It's none of that. It is just the unwritten Constitution. Now, a few examples of this. Political parties. Nowhere in the entire Constitution does it say that we should have a political party system, that we should divide among the people. Nope. That is something that evolved after the presidency of George Washington and has just happened ever since. We have aligned ourselves with people who have the same political ideology as ourselves, and then we've voted based on that. But nowhere does it say in the Constitution that this is how political parties work. This is how they nominate people. Not a chance. In fact, the founding fathers didn't want them at all because it would lead to division of this great country, and they saw that as a terrible, terrible thing. Now, we've already talked about the second one here, the cabinet, the president's cabinet. This was not written into the Constitution, but it is mentioned on how we choose people within the government. There is a process there of how to vet officials who are nominated by the president, but the cabinet itself was not written into. Washington created the cabinet. He had a group of advisors, and that is just something that each president after that utilized and grew and came to have this greater group of advisors as the nation progressed. Judicial review, the Supreme Court's ability to evaluate laws based on the Constitution, actions of the president based on the Constitution, not written into the Constitution at all. In fact, it comes from the landmark court case Marbury versus Madison, as we talked about before. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say the Supreme Court has the power to evaluate actions and laws based on the Constitution. Nope, it's something that was adopted over time and has stuck ever since. The last piece that we're going to look at, congressional committees. Nowhere does it say that within the House and within the Senate we should have specialized committees to evaluate bills to get them ready to send off to the president. Nope, nowhere. But it's something that made the process of writing a bill become more efficient. So it's something we've utilized, it was successful, and we've held on to it ever since. The unwritten Constitution is all about tradition and custom that works, that makes this system run more efficiently. Now, I want you to go all the way back to the beginning of your packet to that question, and this is the final thing that I want to leave you with. What is the importance of a structured government? Think about that question now that we've talked about the federal government and its three branches, the design of the Constitution to keep this system going. Why do you think it's important we have a structured government? Why did they structure the government for the country at all? You answer that question again, not an essay, not a paragraph, just a sentence or two. Your thoughts on this subject. And don't forget to finish those main idea questions. There's 5 of them. And any questions that you have along the way, send them off to me.